Who was the enslaved man who turned ink into rebellion, who wielded the pen like a blade against his captors? What if freedom wasn't taken, it was written? They called him Samuel, though that name carried the weight of chains. It wasn't the one whispered by his mother before her voice was stolen by a master's whip. It was a name etched into a ledger, another entry of ownership, another mark of control. He was born on the edge of a Louisiana cane field, where dawn broke with the cry of labor and night never truly ended. To his masters, Samuel was just another backbent under the sun, another number that could be replaced. But beneath the sweat and the scars, something refused to break. Samuel was never meant to read. The law said so, and the lash made sure of it. Words were dangerous, too dangerous. They could set fire to the mind before freeing the flesh. But Samuel hungered for them anyway. He learned in fragments, in whispers, in stolen moments. From torn prayer books tossed aside, from a half-blind preacher who vanished as quickly as he came. Under the moon, Samuel drew letters in the dirt with trembling fingers until they became part of him. The first word he wrote was his own name, then more. Then sentences copied from old shipping manifests, records of lives bought and sold, until the words became his silent rebellion. Then, one storm-soaked night, the world shifted. In the master's house, a broken quill lay forgotten on the floor, cast aside by a boy who fancied himself a poet. Samuel picked it up. He cleaned it with spit and hope, fixed it with a piece of wire, and dipped it into a mix of soot and molasses. The ink bled black like a wound reopening. That night Samuel did the unthinkable. He wrote a pass, the sacred script that allowed a slave to travel between plantations. A name, a time, a destination. One paper could mean a mile of freedom, or death if caught. His first forgery was clumsy. The writing too neat, the lines too deliberate, yet somehow it worked. The man who carried it vanished into the woods and, days later, returned with a look Samuel had never seen before. Hope. He hugged Samuel without words, his back still raw with scars. That night, Samuel dreamed of open doors. Soon his hand grew steadier. His forgeries became art. He learned to mimic overseers' signatures, to press seals from melted wax and stolen coins. He learned the rhythm of deception, the music of freedom written in forged lines. But as the paper spread, so did something else. Whispers. Soft voices at the edge of the barn, calling names he hadn't yet written. Some nights he'd wake to find a finished pass beside him, though he had no memory of writing it. The pen, once his tool, now seemed to move by its own will, scratching through the dark as if guided by unseen hands. The passes began to multiply like a fever. For every man or woman who vanished into the night clutching Samuel's creation, 2 more came knocking in the dark, whispering through the cracks in the walls. He could no longer keep count. The ink never dried. The papers seemed to breathe. And still he wrote, until his fingers blistered, until his eyes burned dry. Among the enslaved, Samuel's name became a secret prayer. Among the masters it became a curse. They said there was a slave who could imitate any hand, forge any seal, and twist the written word into rebellion. Some called him a demon, others a ghost. No one ever saw his face, only the echoes of his work, empty cabins, broken gates, and the haunting shimmer of torches searching for what they couldn't catch. Because Samuel wasn't just writing passes anymore. He was creating lives, entire identities birthed from soot and defiance, names of men and women who no longer existed, or perhaps never had, places that could not be found on any map. Each letter was a lie. Each lie, a doorway, and when the masters finally realized what he had done, it was already too late. His words had outlived him. They traveled farther than chains could reach, whispered through generations. For in a world built on ownership, Samuel rewrote the only truth that mattered, that no man could own a soul that could write its own name. Towns burned under the shadow of war. Floods devoured whole ports, and the names of overseers long buried began reappearing on papers they could never have signed, ghostly signatures granting life to those still bound in chains. The forged documents shimmered faintly in moonlight, as if they remembered what they were created to undo. But freedom, Samuel learned, was never free. It demanded something in return. At first the price was small, a tremor in the air, a silence too heavy to ignore. Then it grew. The nights thickened around the barn where he worked, the air tasting of rust and something far older than blood. Things began to move on their own. The pen would roll from the table without touch. Papers rustled though the wind was still. Once he came back from the fields to find a completed pass waiting for him, written in his own hand, though he had never touched the quill. He tried to burn it, but the flames recoiled and died cold. Behind the barn, Samuel marked every life he helped free with a line in the dirt, a tally of salvation. But as the lines multiplied, the whispers began, soft at first, then layered and strange in tongues no man spoke. At night he heard weeping, dragging footsteps, and always, just before dawn, a single voice calling a name he didn't remember writing. He thought it was guilt until the dreams came. In his sleep, he walked through a house made of rot and bone. Ink dripped down the walls like rain, the furniture twisted from human shapes. In each room stood a figure holding one of his forged passes. None spoke. They only stared, faces blank, eyes hollow, papers pressed like open wounds to their chests. Then one night, one of them pointed, not at him, but beyond him. Samuel turned and saw a mirror. In it, he wasn't human anymore. His hands were black as ink, his skin crawling with words, and a pen hovered before his heart, still waiting. He woke with the taste of paper in his mouth. Still, he wrote. Because if he stopped, the silence would devour him. Because every forged name felt like a debt to something ancient that demanded payment in return. Because this system of cruelty was a machine, and Samuel had learned to rot it from the inside. But some part of him knew, with every signature, every stolen seal, he wasn't just freeing the enslaved, he was writing himself out of existence. And then came the circle. No one ever spoke of it aloud, not even in whispers between rows of cane. It was born from fear and necessity. Samuel's work had grown too vast, too perfect to handle alone. The pen had found new hands. The first was Lena, a washerwoman whose quiet unsettled even the cruelest overseer. She was the first to carry one of Samuel's forged documents across county lines. When she returned 6 nights later, her dress was torn, her eyes empty but alive. From that moment on, she never left his side. She learned without instruction, how to fold parchment just so, how to melt wax without smoke, how to press false seals with carved wood and broken buttons. Then came Ezra, a bent-backed field hand with a mind sharp as glass. He remembered patrol routes, imitated overseers' voices, and carried no fear, because the men who once broke him had already taken everything they could. He became Samuel's shadow, his living memory. Others joined. A network formed, not of names or symbols, but of rhythm and trust. They moved like breath through dying lungs, silent and steady. Passes traveled faster now, hidden in cotton bales, tucked into jars of lard, sewn into hems of skirts. A whispered name in the right ear could make a folded scrap of salvation appear beneath a bowl, marked with a smudge only the desperate could read. A man vanished from a chain gang with only a coin and a prayer. Another floated across a river pretending to be dead, a pass stitched beneath his tongue. Each escape fed the growing hunger of the network. But with every success, the air grew colder. The ink dried faster, sometimes before it touched the page. The barn felt hollow. Lena stopped speaking altogether. She would sit for hours clutching blank sheets until her knuckles cracked. Ezra began tilting his head as though listening to whispers only he could hear. They were changing, becoming part of whatever had claimed the pen. Then one night, a paper came back, folded, torn, stained with something darker than dirt. It bore a name none of them recognized, signed with Samuel's hand, but he swore he hadn't written it. The document pulsed faintly, alive. Lena refused to touch it. Ezra buried it under the barn floor. But when Samuel returned the next night, it lay waiting on the table, clean, whole, and new. Soon after, the disappearances began. First one carrier, then another. No blood, no struggle, just absence, like the earth itself had swallowed them. Samuel tried to stop, just for a single day. But when he woke, his hands were covered in fresh ink, names spiraling up his arm in a language that moved when he looked at it. Ezra wept for no reason. Lena stood at the tree line, whispering to the dark. Something had taken notice. Not the masters, not the patrols, but something older, drawn to the ink, feeding on the names. Every forged pass was a tear in the veil, every signature a summons. The network, once a chain of hope, had become a conduit. By the time the overseers tightened their grip, it was too late. The passes had turned into legend, ghost stories whispered between torches. They traveled farther than anyone could trace, hidden in false bottom crates, smuggled in fish bellies, sewn into quilts that no one dared to wash. The songs of mothers rocked their children to sleep with lullabies that were not lullabies at all, but maps, routes to freedom stitched into melody. And beneath it all, the ink still moved. The pen still wrote. Somewhere in the silence between breaths, Samuel's words kept spreading, alive, restless, and waiting. The masters began to feel it too, a current beneath the soil, trembling through the foundations of their power. It was invisible, but it crawled under their skin like fever. And in their fear they grew crueler. They tore through the quarters at night, searching for phantoms and finding only flesh to punish. Ink became contraband, paper a weapon. Men were lashed for owning chalk. Women were whipped for humming songs whose melodies felt too free. They weren't just hunting people anymore. They were hunting words, the shape of freedom before it could be spoken. Samuel watched his world shrink into silence. He abandoned the barn and took refuge in the woods, burying his pen beneath roots and hiding his forged papers under stones that bore no markings of God or man. He wrote only when the forest allowed him to, when even the crickets fell quiet and the moon refused to watch. But the woods were not empty. They breathed. They listened. The pen began to resist him, dragging across the page in strange angles, bleeding ink from an unseen well. Sometimes it wrote without his touch, lines in no language he knew, words that clung to paper like scabs. The forest thickened with dread. Ezra stopped speaking, curling into himself at the edge of the clearing, eyes hollow, whispering to things that weren't there. Then Lena disappeared. 3 days of silence passed before she returned, barefoot, her feet torn and bleeding, her mouth filled with dirt. She said nothing. She only placed a slip of paper in Samuel's hand. One word was written across it. Home. Then she collapsed. That night, Samuel followed her trail into the forest. Deeper than he'd ever gone. Past the stream, past the roots that clawed from the earth like hands. There, in a clearing where even the wind refused to pass, he found it. The house without doors, 4 walls of black wood, a roof that leaned away from the sky and no windows, only absence shaped like structure. The air around it pulsed like breath. Lena walked straight through its walls. Samuel stayed outside, frozen. Inside, he heard dripping ink, the slow grind of quills, whispers looping over themselves. Then footsteps, heavy, not hers. He ran, but the dream followed him. Again and again he saw the house, saw the figures standing outside it, faces he knew, faces he'd freed, their mouths stitched shut, their eyes pleading. Behind them stood something tall and thin, stitched together from parchment and bone, its hands ending in quills that bled ink, its mouth sealed and resealed with wax. And every morning Samuel woke clutching his pen, fresh documents scattered before him, perfect, signed, stamped, all bearing names of people who would vanish that day. The ink refused to dry now. It shimmered wet even under the sun, like the paper rejected the lies it carried. Samuel stopped sleeping. When he closed his eyes, the dreams waited like wolves. He wrote compulsively, unable to stop, the pen moving as though it had its own pulse. The names came faster, some he didn't recognize, some that couldn't belong to the living. He no longer wrote just passes, but deeds, manumissions, whole histories for people who had never existed. Yet when he handed one of these papers to a woman who had come wordlessly through the trees, she looked at it and whispered, trembling, "This is mine." It's always been mine. Others followed. They came from the woods, from dried riverbeds, from nowhere. Some bled, some smiled. None spoke of how they found him. They took the documents he didn't remember writing and never came back. Lena vanished for the last time. Ezra stayed behind, still as stone. He hadn't moved or eaten in days. Samuel tried to rouse him, but Ezra's body was rigid, his eyes dull, his mouth slightly open. Inside it, Samuel saw a rolled parchment sealed in wax that glowed faintly red. He didn't open it. He ran. Through swamps thick with rot and fog, he moved without thought, guided by whispers that slipped between his heartbeats. The path curved in impossible ways. Trees bent toward him, their bark carved with letters that seemed to breathe. The air trembled, time stretched thin, and then he saw it again. The house without doors. It was larger now. Its walls throbbed like veins, the ground beneath it pulsing in rhythm. The roof sagged as if burdened by unseen weight. A doorway yawned where none had been before. Inside, a single light burned, steady, waiting. Samuel stepped closer, and the air grew heavy, pressing against his chest like the moment before a name is spoken. He crossed the threshold. The house exhaled. Inside was a desk, a chair, a single flame that cast no shadow. The walls were lined not with books but with papers, thousands of them, stacked high, each one written in his hand. His name, his script, his rebellion. He sat because he understood now. This place had always been waiting for him. The pen lay on the table, full, smooth, obedient. It moved without resistance. A name appeared. Then another. Then another. Weeks later, patrolmen found a wooden box buried beneath the roots of a cypress tree. Inside were hundreds of documents, passes, deeds, letters of freedom, all perfect, all signed in the same hand. Each belonged to a person who had vanished without trace, without record, without end. The box was archived, mislabeled, forgotten. But even now, in places where the air grows still and the woods lean close, travelers swear they sometimes find folded papers at their feet, dry, unaged, untouched by time, bearing names they've never heard, written in ink that never dries. This is the Forgotten Cell, where stories don't end, they wait.